Second to make sure that's rolling.
You're like, no, I need to put on my.
All right. Okay. So welcome here to this.
Oh no, he's gone.
Oh no. Hi everyone. We're live streaming.
That is hilarious.
So funny. Yes.
Oh, poor Ethan.
Hello world. Yes.
Poor Ethan. Oh god, he's going to be so embarrassed about that he's really good.
No, he's okay.
It's okay.
You're back.
Okay, I'm back.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
You know, when you hit the wrong button, that
Oh no.
I know
was
that
like,
happens, right?
this meeting is being live streamed. No, please. No, wait, you're the one that live streamed it. Okay. So yeah, I was about to say welcome to this ever-shifting group that we have here, which started as a group of friends who doing podcasting, just to up-level our game, more listeners, subscribers, revenue, whatever we're searching for to optimize. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, and evolving into all sorts of new things. Like I've started this NFT podcast since then that's kind of gotten huge and turned into a convention. We've had people come and go in the group from different countries, and the VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn, Rob Greenlee, has been a big part of this from the start. So welcome back again. And we try to have guests come through here. And this week we're bringing in Yukimi Song, who I don't know if we've ever actually had a conversation, and this is kind of fun to have this moment where we can connect because we've had a business relationship basically over the years. Right. And so this will be fun to kind of like get to know each other even better. So I will give an intro to Yukimi, and she can polish it up, and I guess Clara as well, who's kind of her partner in crime here. But I'll throw us off. You guys can introduce yourselves. And typically what we do is I'll ask some questions. I'll kind of guide the conversation for a little bit. Mark's a regular here, so he'll chime in with his questions and conversation. It goes several directions. It could be anything from you sharing your expertise and experiences with us to us doing that for you. If you've got questions and thoughts, we can bring some something interesting to the conversation. Oh, actually, before I do the intros, let me I'll just bring us back to, I was mentioning how I created this background that I'm using right now pretty quickly in Canva. And so I don't know, let me just do a quick screen share and just kind of show what that's like. It's not that hard to do. And now I have this, what is this stupid thing? I'm going to have this. Hide floating meeting controls, get that out of here. I don't want to learn more about that. I just want to go back. Okay. Yeah. So really I just, I went to the home screen of Canva and I just searched Zoom background and then kind of created a template. And then in that case, after the template was created, I had kind of like a placeholder here, right? Actually the video wasn't there. It was just a placeholder that had some text here and some graphics and stuff like that. And then what I did is I went to videos. So I went to elements and I went to the video option there, and I just chose the word loop. And so that way I knew that I would have a graphic that if it continued to play, it would kind of loop into itself and it wouldn't get distracting at the transitions. And then, they had a lot of interesting options here. So you could go a totally different direction you want. Maybe I want to get super flashy and put that one there. That would be way too distracting. But, you get something like that. Click the position, make sure it's in the background behind whatever other graphics. So these other graphics were still here in the front. And I could even, if I didn't want it to be that intense, I could like reduce the transparency or something like that. And you've got that. And then all you have to do is hit share, download as MP4 video. And then when you go to Zoom, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see my Zoom, but when you go to Zoom, it's got the option in the lower left-hand corner to add like a video background or to add a background or an effects or something like that. And then you can it asks whether you want to choose a photo or a video. You choose video, and then, choose the one that you like, and pops up right behind you. And then beyond that, it does help, but it's not 100% necessary. I do have a green screen. And so that does help make it a little bit clearer. And now I want to stop sharing the screen. There we go. So yeah, I don't know. That's helpful for anybody out there, or you guys, if you find it cool. And my green screen is just a cool. It's this little pop-up green screen. Actually, it comes in a big tube. You can find them on Amazon for like $200. And you open up the lid, you pull out the legs, and it's like a reverse projector. You know how you pull down a projector, you can pull up the green screen. So it's quick and easy to store. So a little pointer up top. Now let's introduce Yukimi, the star of the show today.
Okay. So hi everyone.
Hi.
I'm Yukimi Song, and I live in Brooklyn, New York. And then I actually know of Ethan through a professional relationship. I needed a piano tuner, and I was Googling, and I found Floating Piano Factory. And then I started out. Ethan was like a really high top end guy. So at the time I couldn't afford your service. So I chose someone who is under your guidance.
Apprenticeship.
Yeah. And then it was Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
And he was my tuner for a long time, and then he had to leave the city, so now I have someone else. But that sort of relationship. So we exchanged emails in the past, Ethan, I believe, and then also I noticed that you were not only doing operating a company, but you've been doing a lot of different things. So I was sort of following you on social media. I don't remember if it's the LinkedIn or Facebook, or I don't remember, but yeah. So I'm a podcaster, and then Clara Zhang is here too, and she's my podcast partner, and we've been doing the podcast since the August of 2020. But I've always wanted to do the podcast since my NYU time, which is 2007-ish. Like, somebody told me I should do a podcast because my undergraduate background was a degree in communications. So I've always wanted to be like a sort of be in that sort of media world, and I love creating content, using videos and stuff like that. But I didn't have the time, and I was like, at the time, podcast, what is that? And then at the time, smartphone just started to come out, and then fast forward, finally I was able to make my dream come true, I guess. 2020, everybody, I think, started doing something, and so podcast was one of my passion projects.
It literally went from like 1 million to 2 million podcasts,
Wow.
in a matter of a couple of years. And I think the pandemic really made that happen. Yeah.
Right. And it's still growing, right? And I think it's a really great way. Like, everybody can be the podcaster if you learn the way to do it. So I've been enjoying it. My podcast is about bringing the pianists, or, those who are in the music industry, has been breaking the new exciting ground in the industry, because I have been teaching piano for a long time, and I especially started teaching young children when I moved to New York, and I started to realize there is a disconnect between the musicians, the music teachers, and the market, and I just wanted to sort of fill the gap. Create like a little bridge between the market and the musicians. So that's the reason I started. And then since then, we've been interviewing quite a lot of amazing pianists, and not only classical A-listers, but also crossover pianists, to social media influencers, to music pedagogues, to so many different people. So it's been a wonderful journey.
Very cool. Yeah. And when you say bridging to the market or the industry, I think you said, what encompasses that when you say that? Is that the students? Is that the listeners of piano music? Is that, all of the above? What does that represent to you, bridging to the, I think you call it the market?
Well, first I started out as a sort of a almost like a grievance to the parents of the students. So, as a teacher, their clients, so I couldn't directly say, but maybe I can influence their mindset or change their mindset slowly by creating this podcast. That's my initial thought. But it became a sort of thing where even the other day I got a feedback from someone that I got to know, and he says, wow, I listened to one of your episodes and I didn't realize what it took to become a pianist. And then there's a whole, big world out there of classical music world that I did not know. So that was a yay for me. Then he would start listening to maybe a few, pieces on iTunes or Spotify or something about classical piano. So that's to me a big success. So
Got it. So it's sort of like opening up folks' minds to classical music and especially piano music.
Right. But also having to have this conversation, we musicians also have to change our mindset, like how we are going to reach out to the market or listeners or students. Like we can't just have this traditional way of reaching out. There are so many new ways, 21st century ways to reach out to the community and create the community, digital community. And there are so many creative ways. So, but we tend to think of one way, especially classical musicians, we have this traditional training. So that's something that I also want to change a musician's mindset.
Beautiful. Let's bring Clara into the conversation. Clara, tell us how you met Yukimi and how she roped you into this podcasting project.
Absolutely.
Or vice versa. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, no. Yukimi has been a long old friend, right? Ever since I think we moved to the city around the same time. And I came here I got a job in New York the day after I got my master's degree, so it was kind of like everything happened so fast. And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, it was kind of a crazy road, that whatever happened. And I only knew one friend, and who we had a dual partner. She was a cellist, and Yukimi became her roommate, I believe, right? So, and that's how we initially met. But we were busy, but Yukimi has just been so amazing. It's like I think we were, before the pandemic, we were friends, but we both didn't have so much time to hang out all the time. So we saw each other maybe even once every couple of years, something. And I think there were always times I felt like Yukimi gave me a lot of advice. Like I was, a little hot-headed young musician, and also, I didn't go to school here, so it was kind of a different experience, right? When you just come here and work and then eventually open up my own business. So beginning of the pandemic, one day she just reached out to me and another friend of ours that was like, let's try this. And I was like, you know what? This is amazing. I love podcasts to begin with. Even before the pandemic started, I was, I have a personality. I go to a lot of different places. I go to different events. So I was always on the train a lot. You live in Brooklyn, before, so you know how it is. So I spend a lot of time just, when I'm commuting, listening to something. And podcast was one of those things you could download to your phone, even when there's no Wi-Fi, right? So like when I want to travel, but I didn't have the time to travel, I would download a traveling podcast. Or if I have, somebody I'm curious, I listen to other audibles. But if I didn't, and I would listen to a podcast of them first before I even listen to a book. So when Yukimi first told me the idea that she had, I was like, okay, I'm all in, And I also wanted to make a documentary of classical musicians, I don't know. I mean, I grew up in China and in the long generation. In a way, I almost feel like it's kind of a boring story. Like we start when we were 3 and you go to the conservatory when you're 11, you move out of home when you were 11, and then I moved to Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, out of all places when I was 17 after a tour. So you're so used to just being a classical musician. You hide in the practice room, but as I grew older and then, later on teach my student, I realized how, yeah, exactly, just like what Kimi was saying, how people don't really understand us. It's like we're such unique beings. So I wanted to make a documentary of classical musicians living in 21st century. So when she gave me the idea of the podcast, I was like, okay, this could be the first step, right? So yeah, and then we've been having a fun time. And I also know a lot of people. Like we interviewed one of my former student who is a YouTube celebrity, a YouTuber in Malaysia, and he also was helping us a lot in the very beginning. We've been live streaming, and he had all these fans, everybody, so it's really cool. Yeah. So,
that's awesome. Yeah, and it's interesting to see the different angles, and I'm realizing I probably should have you on a different thing that I do on Saturdays, which it's called Piano Tech Radio Hour, which is even more focused on pianos, and that could be an interesting conversation. I actually had Andrew Inkovet.
Oh, yes.
So he was my guest this last Saturday. So but yeah, let's do that as well.
Oh yeah.
I got 3 emails from him this morning.
Oh wow, that's cool. It's interesting, the little communities we have. So Clara, I want to go back to you, Kimi, but I do want to follow up with you. I'm curious, having listened to podcasts and being a fan of podcasts, what do you bring then to making your own podcast? Anything specific that you've taken from, as an example, from a podcast that you're a fan of, or think about how you're going to produce what you make?
Well, again, I kind of have the easier part. Yukimi does most of the editing for us.
Sure.
And, and she has also had a background, as, she mentioned. What I did bring a lot of different kind of guests initially. I'm someone who has interesting interest of people. Like I love also just I have this goal of making the world a better place, so I am very into the personal development, all of that. So I think and then I also was the person who was doing a lot of social media in the beginning, but then I got a little burned out, and Kimi actually stepped in also. We collaborate on that. But I think for the most part, it's just the idea of, like what Kimi was saying, a lot of times us as the classical musicians, we're so used to, it's comforting for us to just hide in the practice room, practice 10 hours every single day, and not even say much, and then we just go perform, and then we criticize ourselves so much. And that is something I kind of want to change, that sure, we have to practice. Sure, I still, my teacher lives across the street from me. He's 80, he still practices 5 hours a day. And I want to also bring that. And I also have a lot of students that are adults. I have a couple that they're 83. They follow our podcast every single episode. I have a lot of professors in Kansas or Massachusetts, or, some actually in Chicago. They always write to me. So one thing is I want to sort of bring this gap of, like, even we're classical musicians, we don't always have to live like the same lifestyle of 300 years ago, right? We could live in the modern world. So that's one thing I really want to make it possible, for most people.
Cool. Yeah. And I've realized there's a pattern here. When people ask me, my number one advice in starting a podcast, the first thing I go to often is to find a partner to do it with, because it makes it so much easier when you have at least just one other person, whether they're co-hosting or finding guests or helping with the social media, whatever it is. It's so much different than doing it alone. Yeah, Yukimi, I'm guessing you sort of intuitively saw that as a potential help in doing it. Did you try to start anything on your own before this, or
yeah, good question. Actually, so there's like a little test version of a podcast, but I didn't commit to podcast because podcast platform itself costs a little bit of money. So before I commit to that, I started a vlog sort of thing, but using my students. So I interviewed like 2 or 3 students out of my piano studios who, had been at the time studying with me for 10 years or so. And one of my students wrote a song, and then with her friend, they, master the whole thing, and then now their songs are on the streaming services. But you talk about their 16, 17 using all the, GarageBand to what is it, Logic Pro? That's yeah, right. And
Logic is I feel it's Logic is kind of like the professional version of like a garage band, right? Yeah.
Exactly, from Apple. So I was very impressed. And then she says, my student says, I want to make a little bit of money, I need a loan. So might as well just post it on, Apple iTunes or something and streaming services, and then make a little bit of money. But I don't know how much money she made. But so I interviewed her, and I interviewed another student, and then I think I interviewed my piano tuner, Isaac. But he already moved to Arizona, but I wanted to sort of reconnect with him and what's going on. And, so I did that little thing. So that was a start. Then I talked to Clara and another friend of us, and they all agreed to join me, which was incredible, because I don't think I could have gone this far, especially without Clara. And so I really appreciate, and I think it's just a dynamic between us, Clara and I, and especially when we do our own episode, just 2 of us, the downloads get higher. I think they like our conversation. They like sometimes we really talk about something silly. And so, yeah, it's been, yeah. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's good to just see the different ways that people do take advantage of a partner. So we often hear, we'd like to also talk about kind of business and the way that integrates with podcasting. So can you give us a little bit of a background? You're one of those folks that, you've taken, teaching independently into a different level, and have like a music school, a music studio where there's other teachers teaching for you. I know as my own business owner, it's a struggle. There's lots of positives to it. There's challenges. Can you just give us, just for context, a little bit of the history of you going from like a solo kind of freelance piano teacher into growing and expanding a business around that?
Yeah, I am still solo in so many ways, but I wanted to start the company because someone told me at the time that there's a potential to grow, and then maybe you can create your own method or something. So that's how I started and created my company. And then since then, yes, my studio got bigger, and also I am doing coaching business, and then what else? Like so many things. So, and a podcast became one of them. And then now I'm more focused on the podcast part, where now I'm in a position where I can also teach people how to start a podcast. So that is one project I have in mind. And also another thing would be, we started the, what is it? Clara, help me. This year we started the new thing. So Linktree has a way to Patreon. Yes, thank you. Patreon.
Oh, great,
sorry.
Great.
Yeah, I knew the letter P, but I just was it piano or no? Anyway, Patreon. So yeah, that's been a challenge. Like, how can we our podcasts to get to the next level? And we create a very good quality content, but of course there are so many ways to polish our content and make it, maybe we can make a shorter episodes out of the big ones, and we are really, thinking a lot of things. And we also do the video version of it. So, sometimes pianists would come and then play something for us, and then, that's a very good way to engage more audience. So monetization is the next level, which is not easy, but I take the challenge.
Cool. How would somebody find your Patreon? Where would I, is it like
the patreon.com/the piano pod.
patreon.com/the piano pod or piano
Yeah,
pod?
that piano pod.
The piano pod. Okay, cool.
We just created the page, so it's not complete yet. So we're still developing. But, yeah.
We just in our introductory episode. So.
Okay, cool. So it looks like you have the basics here, and you've got like a $9.99 per month membership, and you're kind of developing kind of the benefits of subscription and things like that. Yeah.
Right.
Special features. Okay. Yeah. Very cool. Actually, I've known about Patreon for such a long time, and for whatever reason, it hasn't always fit in. It's always seemed like it would fit in, but I never actually tried it. So I have to report back in a few months about how things are going and growing. Mark, do you have a Patreon? I know Henry started one.
I started one a long time ago when I was setting up the podcast. I've been doing my podcast for about 4.5 years, about 380 episodes, and I set everything up, all the social media accounts, everything, set them all up at the same time, because I thought, do the hard work straight away, and then sort of when things come more interesting or more relevant to my podcast, I would have everything available. And actually set up the Patreon account, and actually had at the time, and this is probably 2.5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, the idea was that you had 3 levels. So you had your sort of junior level, your middle level, and then your top level, your VIP level. And I set that up with the idea of being able to share merchandise or share ideas behind the scenes stuff. And it never really kicked in as a place. At the time, it really was a long time ago, because I remember looking at other people who were doing podcasts on Patreon. And a lot of them, like now it's relatively sophisticated and they've got a real good strategy for Patreon, how they're going to do things. But at the time, I remember reading these things like, if I don't get $100 or whatever it was, $500, I'm not going to be able to keep my podcast going. And it was all very all very at the early stages. And now I've seen some really successful people be able to build courses through Patreon. And then, I think it's like a £49. He's a UK guy, a month, and he provides different things about personal development. It's a very personal development course that he's leveraged through Patreon. So I assume, I've not joined that course, but I assume he uses a Zoom and people pay a sort of membership fee. In a sense, it's another way of creating some sort of membership account that you can have interaction with your patrons. So I've never really leveraged it and promoted it enough to see if it actually works or not, because it was one of those I thought that I would just start and then see how things developed. And other projects and other interests took me away from Patreon. But I know some of the guys that I follow on YouTube do it really successfully, and they can have, like, if you start getting towards that 30, 50, 100 patrons, having a regular fee coming in for behind the scenes or additional services that you can provide, it can be a really substantial sort of income that you can leverage. And as I say, there's a couple of guys in the UK that are doing things that they've actually sort of lifted and shifted the whole Patreon idea and built it into their own website. And so they've now created a membership account. This is a business focused one. And he's now sort of lifted and shifted the sort of idea behind Patreon and put it onto a website. And he's now got, I think it's either 2,500 or 3,500 people that are using that sort of membership idea onto a website. So yeah, it can definitely take you in lots of different ways. As I say, I've never promoted it enough, because my promotion, I want to do it on my podcast. I want to promote my podcast, not necessarily promote a Patreon account. So yeah, it's lots of experiences and And there's lots of new things that Patreon are really trying to leverage. YouTubers, it's something they're working hard on being able to leverage that community, as well as podcasters.
You, Kimi and Clara, are you utilizing YouTube for the content as well? Or yeah?
Yeah. And we usually have a premiere on YouTube, so you can set it in such a way. And then also we do the live stream, pre-recorded content, and then live stream on Facebook. And we used to use Restream to live stream on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and something else. LinkedIn too. Mm-hmm. But we just realized, Restream, we're paying for really, low amount of viewership. So we decided to discontinue. So we are live streaming right now on Facebook and then premiering on YouTube.
Cool. Very cool. So it's interesting to hear your background, musicianship, teaching, wanting to connect with the broader audience and like show them, the pleasure and curiosity around classical music. And you mentioned, you're working on monetizing things at this moment. I guess I want to take a step back in as you started the podcast, and different people have different levels of intentionality around starting a podcast. Sometimes it's just, I always wanted to start one, so I started one. Some people are very intentional, I want to start this podcast. It's going to do X, Y, Z for me in some other domain, right? It's kind of like a conduit for something else. What did you have when you started the podcast in terms of like the purpose behind it? And also, where are you now, right? Have you changed? Okay, I can do this, with the podcast now that I see what I have available.
I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question.
Let me rephrase it.
Yeah.
Let's just start with starting the podcast. Mm-hmm. So we covered that a little bit, how you said you kind of always wanted to start one. How much of starting the podcast was, I just want to have a podcast, I want to try it out. Mm-hmm. And how much of it was, I'm going to start this podcast and it's going to be a networking opportunity, for example. What was like the intentionality around starting it?
Yeah, so starting was really the dream of connecting the market and then the musicians. And then but it is still the same. However, also my thing is that musicians also should change our mindset about how we can reach out to the community, how we can reach out to our own niche. Instead of, like Clara says, just stuck in a good old, practice room and then being told what to do, because that's what most classical musicians do. But there are so many ways to be creative, and there's nothing wrong with being creative. So that's something that I am more, my show is, I think Clara would agree with me, but changing towards. So it's not just about who we are as classical musicians, but it's about, hey, classical musicians, we are inviting amazing guests who have brilliant ideas, and then listen to our show. And then why don't you change the way you think about classical music? Because one thing you constantly hear is classical music world is dying, right? Then so we had a few guests, we discussed about those things, and then it's actually very much thriving, industry. But if we don't change the way or approach to our audience, then I think we get stuck. We are stuck. So
can I ask a quick question, Ethan?
Of course, yeah, go for it.
One of the things I think classical music struggles is accessibility. Is that some people don't necessarily know where to find classical music. It could be piano, it could be opera, it could be whatever. how do you see that the podcast is a way of being able to make it more accessible, and what strategies are you using to try and make it as accessible as possible?
Oh, that's a very excellent question. One of the things we're doing is creating a playlist on Spotify. So monthly Spotify. So we basically feature the pieces by the composers who were born on a specific month, or sometimes creating a list by the guests of that month, that sort of thing. Yeah, we're trying. Yeah.
Which actually sometimes had inspired certain guests to come to our show, right? I remember Frederick True was a pianist who we featured his.
Oh, Frederick True. I know him. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
He's great.
Yeah, so by creating playlist, and then we put, for example, 2 years ago, we put one of his pieces, performance on our playlist. And then, we would promote that Spotify playlist on, Instagram, and then make sure we tag him. And then he noticed our podcast show. And then the next thing you know, he was on our show. So that's one of our ways to sort of connect with people.
So you put him on the playlist first, and that sort of ended up being a way of attracting him?
Yeah.
And then, so that's interesting. So let's.
Oh, I gave you a secret. Sorry. I gave a business secret.
That's the way. No, but yeah, let's dive into that a little bit. So did it just happen? Was he able to kind of see that you had created it and he reached out to you? Did you create it and then say, hey, we made this playlist. Would you like to join us? How did that connection actually happen?
Well, I think he put the like, or, that post. And then next thing, we sort of flirted. I mean, not in a flirty way, but we usually say this. So let's flirt now. It's time
nothing
to flirt.
Romantic.
Right, nothing romantic, but business flirt, right? Then so I would DM him, or we start liking his posts. Sorry, Mr. Frederick Chu, but anyway. So then I've done this with so many other artists too, and then they like, and then they feel like we have the authority because there's this thing called the Piano Party, the podcast show. And then so when I create, or we create a Spotify, playlist, and then we are musicians, so we know the quality of music, and then we put in a list, and then they were like, whoa, thank you so much. I appreciate you, putting the Spotify playlist. And then not only the classical musicians, but also my students would listen, and my listeners would listen to the Spotify playlist. And then, wow. Then I said, well, if you're interested, would you like to be on our show? And actually, we had a third co-host in the past, and then his name is Eric, and Eric studied with him briefly, right?
Yeah.
So he's the one who was initiating the conversation. So he ended up being on our show. It was one of our favorite episodes.
Would you broaden it away from just piano into other classical music? Do you do that, or are you staying in your niche at the moment that it's mainly based around piano classical?
Tell us, Clara.
Right. Yeah. We actually, the very first episode was a psychologist that Yukimi was in contact with, and he, I think, deal with performance anxiety. So that actually started off our show in the very beginning, and later on, we have had a friend who I have this very close friend she has a day job as a lawyer and a night job as a singer, and so she invited one of her lawyer friends from Tennessee who organize, or I guess entertainment law. So we had lawyers on our show, and we had jazz musicians. We had so it's not really just piano, or if it's not just classical music in a way. We kind of want to branch out into, like, yes, we're classical musicians, but we are also human, right? That we are not that different from. And also, I think for me, one thing I realized that, we live in New York City. I'm on the Upper East Side. Like I mentioned, that a lot of my students, I realized they are just fantastic students, but are not planning on becoming like long. The next generation of like the most famous classical musicians, right? But they all attend the best schools in New York City, private or public schools. Their parents are all, like good people, like hardworking but successful people, right? And I have had experience in the past. Some of my like, students that perform in Carnegie Hall when they were young, and that their parents may be doctors, whatever, surgeons, and they're like, at some point maybe I have to stop piano, right? Because it might not make as much of a living. Maybe I should go become an engineer. I should be a programmer. And I think by us having this show also can, it's sort of an inspiration for them to stay on. So like one of my students, he is now in medical school. He still practices, he only takes like 10-20 minutes lessons. His sister and his cousin, they're much more advanced. But like he was like, doesn't matter how busy I will get, force me not to quit piano because it really helps. And then I have a lot of like adult students that are doctors, surgeons, or nurse practitioners, and they come to me, and they actually, some of them play with me. They're like, when I'm so stressed out, like after surgery, like I had this clarinetist friend who was an eye surgeon, right? He was like, I can't really de-stress, and the only way for me to de-stress is actually go back to practice for a few hours. And I realized that's also important for people who didn't work as a musician, but they have had long-term training, that this is a way for them to kind of still stay within this range.
And just a question, you were talking about monetization. Are you advertising? Are you using ads on your, and are you doing it as sort of embedded ads through a hosting platform, or are you doing a personalized ad from a company that you may know?
We haven't been to that point yet. So we just started, doing registering, on Patreon, and also Linktree has similar things like that. So we're just still figuring out what we want to do. And we actually created a little bit of commercial section in our first episode, which is coming out tomorrow at 8 p.m. So in the middle of the episode, we're doing a little bit of a commercial. Hey, listeners, we're on Patreon. That kind of thing.
Is that an ad that you're a pre-read ad that you've inserted, or is it something that's dynamically added through a hosting platform or wherever?
No, we're just.
The question is, you just read it in the middle of the session, like, okay, and now here's our ad, right? And it's a personal ad for your own Patreon. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's great. I advertise other services that I do. I actually have a podcast agency where I fit people who want to be a podcast guest on multiple podcasts in a year. I actually advertise on my podcast and do it. It's about 1 minute 50, something like that, where I talk about the business and I actually. There's a lot of methodology around whether you have your ads at the start or whether you insert them in the middle, whether that's pre-read or whatever. There definitely seems to be more of a movement towards inserting it in the middle of your podcast or somewhere in your podcast, because that's when people are engaged. What I've experienced, some people that have ads at the start, you'll fast forward on your whatever app you're using 30 seconds, boom, 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 until the adverts are gone, and then you listen to the podcast. So that middle, I still advertise at the start, but I only do 1 minute 50. It's like one of my favorites that has been doing it for years. Tim Ferriss always has like 4 minutes worth of ads at the start, and sadly I got to a point where I was like, well, I just don't want to hear what you're trying to tell me is a good product. So I fast forward it. But yeah, a lot of people that I'm listening to are now putting their ads in the middle, whether it's pre-read or whether it's sort of generated. So what I've started recently, I'm although I'm an entrepreneur and a business owner and run a business podcast, but I've been very, very careful about putting ads that don't really fit my podcast. I've been quite fussy, and we've talked about this, Ethan, quite a lot. And what my hosting platform has done recently is they put advertisements for other podcasts, and you can select which podcast you want to choose. Then it embeds podcast, and that felt a lot more because I could choose which podcasts I wanted the advertised in my podcast. Wi-Fi is a bit funny. So I'm hello. Yeah.
Usually your Wi-Fi is pretty good.
So for me, on every device that they can. So yeah, for me that was nicer to be able to within the podcast that fitted my idea of what I wanted to add, rather than something relatively random that doesn't sort of to what my podcast is.
Sometimes we get like an offer from like a small companies. Oh, do you want to advertise something from our products? But most of the time it's like accessories, and I don't know that would fit.
But
yoga pants. It was one time it was a yoga pants, and then we usually have covered down, so I don't think yoga pants would work. And we don't do yoga. I mean, I'm a yogi, but we don't talk about yoga, so maybe not. So yeah.
But I think it's also something we are still, maybe we're gonna have a transformation this year. We're gonna have a breakthrough, because I think that's one thing as classical musicians we struggle. We don't, like myself. I've been in my studio to celebrate 10th anniversary, but yet, and I kept on getting these recognitions, like in New York, that they rate my studio as top 1%, like they choose 18 out of 1,800 or something. I don't even know how we get on the list. And then Inc. magazine actually even wrote to me, asked me to apply for top 100 female entrepreneur. I just didn't even, I was like, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't feel like a successful business person yet, even though. So I think that's something we are sort of learning to embrace. How can we? And we have had guests, right? Yukimi and I, we're not even guests. We have talked to friends. Sometimes the word entrepreneur is almost not being used very flexibly in this world, right? So I think Yukimi and I are both curious in how can we, be a musician, to be an entrepreneur, be successful. So that's something, hopefully.
Look, I'm not an expert in classical music. I like what I like personally, but I would say don't necessarily turn yourself away from that commercial aspect, whether it's a business or multiple businesses. I think you can still be credible in your industry and access some commerciality by advertising the right products or starting your own school or whatever it is. I think you should just be open to that. It might not be what you want, it might not be how you want to, but I would just say always be open to opportunities, because you never know when one of those opportunities come along and you're like, actually that fits my values, that fits who I want to be, and this is the right commercial avenue for me. So I would say just remain open-minded about those sorts of things.
Good idea.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good advice.
Yeah, and there's, I'm sure you've probably seen them out there. I have a few friends. My previous podcast partner for the Run With It podcast, Chris, was really into Seth Godin, or like Marie Forleo is also a great example. Where
he's also a Landmark graduate, I believe.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, just these different resources. That's one thing also with the Run With It podcast that I realized. You see these patterns when you get to talk to multiple people. The Run With It podcast was, we would interview successful entrepreneurs and then talk to them about a business idea that they had that they didn't have the time to pursue, but they thought was cool, and they could sort of chat through it. But in having talked to so many entrepreneurs, hearing their ideas, finding out what they do, I always find this interesting example. I draw it out every once in a while in a conversation. So if you think about personal finance, as an industry, that you can write a book, create a website, have a service, consulting, all this stuff. I know, from my perspective, what I read, like, I don't know, Rich Dad, Poor Dad or something like that when I was a kid, or, and the thing is, you read one of those books and you go, okay, well, somebody already wrote the book on that, right? There's no space for anybody else to do that. But, what we found out over and over again is, you could have personal finance for, people from Southeast Asia. You could have personal finance for women. You could have personal finance for LGBTQ. You could have personal finance for pianists. You have personal finance for, athletes, right? And so it's really all about, the language that people speak. And so when you're trying to learn about entrepreneurship or whatever it is, it's about finding the person that speaks your language, right? Or when you're teaching about music or whatever the topic you're teaching about, it's also, what's my unique voice that I can talk about it in a way that's different. And there's always going to be space if the more authenticity you can find. So I'm optimistic about your entrepreneurial dreams. But yeah, we usually wrap up right at about an hour. So we should make sure we do that soon here. I do, just before we jump off, want to make sure we very explicitly tell anybody who's paying attention, Facebook or YouTube, whatever, where can people go to, find out more about the podcast and any other stuff that you'd like to share? So let's start with you, Yukimi, and then if Clara has anything that you missed, she can add it. But where would you send people?
Okay, first of all, we have a website, thepianopod.com, and that's a great way to listen to our show, watch our show, and then get a lot of information. And also Linktree / The Piano Pod NYC has a lot of information about upcoming episodes plus social media. So that's a great way. And we also have, of course, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, so forth. But you can find all these information on our Linktree account, Linktree / The Piano Pod NYC.
Very cool. I see it here. There's lots of cool links. And Clara, anything else to add there, or did you cover it?
I'm just saying it's easier to just Google us, but make sure Google The Piano Pod. I've been to parties and people are trying to find The Piano Pod from Spotify, for example. It's a little harder to find on Spotify. Mm-hmm. Everything else, if you just Google The Piano Pod and then you just Google whatever platform, it's easiest. It will just come up right away. So
yeah. Awesome. Well, like I said, we'll have to be in touch, have you on some of my other content soon. And there's plenty for us to talk about. So thanks so much for joining us. Mark, any other last comments before we part for the day?
Just really good luck with the podcast. So you said earlier on about training people to be podcasters. So I dabbled in this for a year or two, and it's a really good way of being able to build your network up and build that up. So I would just say good luck with your endeavors, good luck with your music, and it's been really, really interesting hearing quite a niche podcast, a niche area, which I don't know that much about. It's been really interesting speaking to you and getting to know you both.
Wonderful to know you. Thank you so much for all the advice, Mark. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll be in touch offline, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for letting us be part. Thank you so much.
Of course. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye.